Okay, so you want to own a medieval bakery. Bread is the one thing every person in your town eats every single day, rich or poor. Guaranteed demand, a product nobody can live without. You've basically found the safest business in the medieval economy. You're not wrong about the demand. But here's what you missed. You don't set your price, and you don't set your weight. A king decided both before you were born. Come up an ounce short, and it's not a fine. It's the pillory, your underweight loaf tied around your neck. By the end of this video, you'll know what it actually cost to become a baker in medieval England and France, where the money really came from once you were selling, because it's not only bread, and the hidden system built around the oven itself, one that quietly rigged the entire trade against you. You'll find out why bakers started throwing in a 13th loaf for free, a habit so old it's still called a baker's dozen today. And I'll redefine what this business actually was, because a medieval bakery was never a food business. It was a licensing scheme with a furnace attached. But first, there's one clause in that license that can end with the crown taking your body, not your money. Let's talk about what it actually costs to become a baker, because the entry price isn't one number. It's three completely different businesses depending on where you stand. At the bottom, you're a village baker in a manor economy, sometime around the 1300s. You don't own an oven at all. Nobody below the lord is legally allowed to. Instead, you pay to use his. In France, this system is called the four banal, the common oven. Using it costs you somewhere between 1/10 and 1/5 of everything you bake, handed over in bread, flour, or grain, every single time you fire it up. You didn't buy a bakery. You bought the right to rent one, forever, from a man who can also raise that fee whenever he decides to. This wasn't a quiet arrangement either. Resentment over exactly this kind of forced fee was one of the grievances behind the Jacquerie, the 1358 peasant uprising in northern France, and rebels specifically targeted the lord's mills and ovens, the physical machinery of the fee itself, not just the lord's. In the middle tier, you're a licensed town baker in England, somewhere in London or a market town, after the Assize of bread and ale was codified in 1266. Here you can own your own oven, but building one is expensive stonework, essentially a small masonry furnace with its own outbuilding, kept separate from the house because of the fire risk. This is genuinely one of the reasons bakers cluster together in the same street or quarter of a city, not friendship, insurance. One oven fire in a town of thatched roofs, and you've taken out your neighbors too. Bread Street in London existed as a defended, dedicated bread market precisely because the trade needed to be walled off, both physically and legally, from everyone else. At the top, you're a London guild baker, a freeman of a chartered company. The Worshipful Company of Bakers can trace its roots to 1155, when a baking fraternity in London, recorded in the pipe rolls as the Bolengarii, was already paying an annual fee to the crown just to exist as an organized trade. By the 1300s, that guild had split in two: the white bakers, who made the fine, fashionable, expensive loaf called wastel, and the brown bakers, who made the coarser, cheaper bread most people actually ate. Getting in wasn't a purchase. It was a 7-year unpaid apprenticeship under a master, followed by proving competence and paying entry fees to move up to journeyman. Your entry cost, in other words, wasn't gold up front. It was 7 years of your life. Now, 3 hidden costs nobody warns you about before you commit. First, the oven itself, wherever you get one, isn't a one-time expense. It needs constant firewood, and fuel is one of the largest recurring costs in the entire operation, arguably the single biggest line item after grain itself. Second, you don't just need wheat. You need it ground, and that grinding almost always runs through the same lord's mill, under the same fee structure, before the flour ever reaches your hands. Third, your price is fixed by an authority who has never run a bakery, and it moves against wheat prices, not your costs, meaning a bad harvest can shrink your legal profit margin in the same month your fuel and flour costs go up. Here's the exotic detail worth remembering. In some London households, the burnt, blackened underside of the loaf, the part actually touching the oven floor, was cut off and given to servants, while the top, cleanest part went to the lord of the house. That's the literal medieval origin of the phrase upper crust. So, where does the money actually come from? Think of it like this. Imagine you're allowed to sell exactly one product at exactly one price the government sets every few weeks, and the only thing you control is how big you make each unit. That's a medieval bakery in one sentence. Under the assize of bread and ale, the price of a loaf barely moved, a farthing, a halfpenny, a penny, but the size of the loaf you got for that coin moved constantly, shrinking when wheat was expensive and growing when wheat was cheap. You weren't setting a price. You were adjusting a portion size over and over to protect a margin that regulators had already decided for you. Here's the small number that becomes a big one. The assize built in an allowance for the baker, commonly described as roughly a tenth of the cost of the grain on top of an allowance for bran, fuel, and labor. On a single loaf, sold for a fraction of a penny, that tenth is close to nothing. We're talking fractions of a farthing per loaf. But a working town bakery isn't selling one loaf. It's selling hundreds a day, every day, all year, for the entire span of a career that could run 20 or 30 years. Multiply a near-invisible per-loaf margin by that kind of volume and duration, and a business that looks unprofitable loaf by loaf turns into a stable, generational livelihood, which is exactly why the trade stayed a hereditary, guild-controlled occupation for centuries instead of collapsing. Now flip it around. The regulation that looks like it's crushing your margin is actually what's protecting your customer base. Because bread is priced so predictably, nobody skips buying it, no matter how bad the year gets. Which means your revenue, unlike almost every other medieval trade, doesn't collapse with fashion, taste, or a bad relationship with one customer. It only moves with the price of wheat. Break the income into its real streams. First and largest, the standard assize loaf, fixed weight, fixed price, thin, regulated margin, but massive, dependable daily volume. For most working bakers, this is the bulk of total revenue. Second, premium bread. Wastel, the fine white loaf made from twice-sifted flour, sold to wealthier households and religious houses. Same rough weight of grain, materially higher price, because refined white flour carried a status premium the assize itself allowed for. Third, bulk institutional sales. Monasteries, large households, guild halls, buying in volume, where the vantage loaf system actually worked slightly in the baker's favor on large orders. Fourth, for anyone running a banal oven specifically, straight rental income. Some ovens were leased out whole to a baker or a group of villagers who then collected the baking fee from everyone else in the community. At that point, the furnace itself is the asset. The bread is almost incidental. Here's the formula in one line. Bread income equals loaf volume, times regulated margin per loaf, times how long you can keep the oven running before you're shut down, fined, or replaced. You cannot touch the price. You cannot touch the margin percentage. So every design choice in this trade, oven size, street location, guild membership, apprentice labor, even that extra loaf in every dozen, exists purely to protect one of the other two factors, volume and time. You've walked past this system without seeing it. Picture the last time you saw a recreated medieval street, or visited a market town with a surviving Bread Street, Baker's Row, or Pie Corner. Did you ever wonder why the bakers were all clustered on one lane instead of spread through town like every other shop? That clustering isn't tradition. It's risk management dressed up as geography. One oven fire in a town of thatch and timber threatens every building nearby, so towns and guilds pushed bakeries together onto their own dedicated street, sometimes even outside the main settlement entirely. Insider term number 1, the vantage loaf, also called the inbread. The extra loaf or partial loaf a baker threw in for free whenever selling in bulk to a middleman or wholesaler. It sounds like generosity. It's actually a built-in insurance premium against the exact same scales, the exact same inspectors, and the exact same pillory we opened this video with. Bread was inconsistent, No reliable scales, unstable yeast, oven heat nobody could fully control. So bakers priced in a small, permanent loss to guarantee they never crossed the legal line into short weight. Second insider term, the fournier, the professional oven master who actually ran a lord's communal oven day to day, as distinct from the lord who owned it and the peasants who were forced to use it. The fournier is the person who actually captured the operating profit of the system. Not the lord collecting the fee in the abstract, and not the villagers baking their own dough. Whoever controlled physical access to the fire controlled the business. Now, the invisible design layer, guild membership itself, functioned as a customer protection racket disguised as quality control. The London Guild ran regular inspections, weighed loaves against the Assize standard, and fined or punished bakers who failed. Which sounds purely punitive, until you notice what it also does. It keeps unlicensed, uninspected competitors almost entirely out of the market because nobody trusts bread from a baker the guild hasn't certified. The regulation that constrains you also builds the wall that keeps out everyone who isn't you. And here's your VIP segment: the wealthy households and religious houses buying wastel bread in bulk. A monastery or a noble household wasn't buying one loaf at a time off a shelf. It was placing standing, recurring orders for the expensive, twice-sifted white loaf, at a markup the Assize permitted specifically because refined flour cost more to produce. That single category of customer, a small fraction of your total buyers, likely delivered a disproportionate share of your actual profit, while the daily foot traffic of ordinary loaf buyers mostly just kept the oven fire justified and the volume numbers up. So if the system is this reliable, fixed demand, fixed margin, guild protection, why did bakers still go under constantly? Here's the honest answer: everything else. Start with the largest recurring cost, fuel. An oven that size, run daily, burns through firewood at a rate that competes with grain itself for your single biggest expense. And unlike your selling price, firewood cost was never fixed by any Assize. It moved with local timber supply, with the season, with every other trade also competing for wood. Next, labor. A working bakery needed apprentices and journeymen fed, housed, and eventually paid as they advanced. Obligations that didn't pause just because wheat prices spiked that quarter. Then the milling fee, paid to grind your grain, almost always through the same lord's mill your oven fee already goes to. A second toll on the same raw material before you've sold a single loaf. Then the specific costs nobody warns you about. Guild dues, called quarterage, a recurring membership fee to keep your license active, paid whether business was good or bad that quarter. Inspection risk. The same Assize that guarantees your customer base also runs recurring spot checks on your weight and quality, and repeated failures escalate straight from fines to public punishment. And here's the part that should actually worry you personally. Guild ordinances and manorial courts could hold a master baker personally liable, not the business, you, specifically, for violations committed inside your own bakehouse. That includes violations committed by an apprentice or a servant working under your name. The license you spent 7 years earning can be revoked, and the punishment for what your own staff did badly can land on your body in a public square. This is the tease from the beginning of the video paid off. It was never really about a fine you could budget for. It was about a system built so that responsibility funnels upward to exactly one person. And that person is whoever's name is on the oven. Remember this line: your revenue is one of the most guaranteed things in the medieval economy. Almost everything standing between you and that revenue is the least guaranteed thing in it. 2 mistakes, over and over, took bakers down in this trade, and neither of them was nobody wanted bread. The first mistake, chronic short waiting, whether from genuine bad luck with inconsistent ovens or from deliberate cheating. Take the case of Richard Hayne, a London baker recorded as adulterating his bread with sand to stretch the dough and cut his ingredient costs. When the guild and city authorities caught him, he wasn't merely fined. He was carted to Newgate Prison on a hurdle, with the offending loaf itself carried ahead of him on a lance, while the crowd was told exactly what he'd done. His trade reputation, and very likely his license, ended that day, publicly, at essentially zero notice. The rule this teaches: in a business where your entire margin depends on a fixed weight nobody will renegotiate, cutting corners on the one variable regulators actually measure isn't a shortcut, it's a business-ending bet against near-certain inspection. The second mistake, treating a first offense as the last one, and pushing your luck past a system with almost no tolerance for repeats. William Chester, another London baker, was found in violation seriously enough to be dragged on the hurdle from the Guildhall through Cheapside all the way to Temple Bar, paraded past his own trading street specifically so every other baker in the city would see it happen. Decades later, in 1477, a baker named John Mund was pilloried and forced to publicly confess guilt for selling underweight bread, more than 2 centuries after the original Assize, proving the enforcement never softened with time. Picture the modern equivalent. This is a business model where a repeated parking ticket could end with you paraded through the street, wearing your own defective product as a sign around your neck. Nobody who saw that happen to a neighbor treated the second offense casually. The pattern behind both mistakes is the same. The Assize system wasn't designed to catch a catastrophic collapse. It was designed to catch small, repeated erosions, a slightly light loaf here, a slightly adulterated batch there, and escalate them, publicly, before they ever became a large one. Bakers who died out in this trade didn't get hit by a single disaster. They got caught by an accumulation of small violations that the system was specifically built to notice. So, let's step back for a second. How does a business with this reliable a customer base, a product literally nobody in town can stop buying, also come with a documented, centuries-long trail of bakers publicly punished, discredited, and driven out? Because the reliability and the risk were never in the same place. Compare it to running an ordinary medieval market stall selling something optional: cloth, spices, ale on a slow week. That trade lives or dies on demand, on taste, on whether people happen to have coin that month. A bakery never has that problem. Demand for bread simply does not go away. What can go away instantly and publicly is your license to sell it. Because the same fixed price and fixed weight that guarantee your customer base also hand a small army of inspectors an exact, unambiguous line to measure you against every single time you sell. That's the real trade at the center of this entire industry: guaranteed demand against an almost completely unguaranteed right to keep operating. You don't compete for customers. You compete against a measuring scale, a set of guild inspectors, and a manorial court, all of whom can end your business over an ounce of dough, while the actual market for your product never once wavers. Which raises the obvious next question. If the demand is this locked in, what did it actually look like for the people who made it all the way to the top of this trade? So here's the real question you came here for. What would you actually have made if you'd done all of this right? Scenario 1. Modest. You're a licensed brown bread baker in an English market town, working your own small oven instead of renting the Lord's. Your investment isn't gold up front. It's the 7 unpaid years of apprenticeship you already spent, plus a basic oven and enough working capital to keep buying grain by the quarter. Here's what that grain actually buys you. The Assize ties your loaf size directly to the wheat price. So when wheat is cheap, at around 6 shillings a quarter, your legal farthing loaf weighs close to 2 pounds. Let wheat price double to 12 shillings a quarter, and that same farthing loaf legally shrinks to about 1 pound. Same coin in your hand either way. Your margin, baked into that same law, sits at roughly 1/10 of your grain cost, on top of a separate allowance for bran, fuel, and labor. On one loaf, that's nothing. Across hundreds of loaves a day, every day for a working lifetime, it adds up to a modest, dependable living. Never a fortune, never a bankruptcy either, as long as you keep passing inspection. Call it boring. Call it survivable. In an economy where entire trades could vanish with one bad harvest, boring and survivable was most bakers' actual best-case outcome. Scenario 2. The top of the trade. You're a freeman of the White Bakers Guild in London after their 1509 royal charter, selling wastel, the expensive twice-sifted white loaf, to wealthy households and religious houses on standing orders. Getting in cost real money up front this time. Entry premiums into London's guilds in this period commonly ran from about 6 shillings 8 pence at the low end up to £3 or more, depending on the trade and your connections, on top of a proper masonry oven and a spot on a defended bread street. What you get for that money is the same volume game as Scenario 1, except every loaf you sell carries a materially higher price for the same weight of grain because refined white flour carried its own built-in status premium under the Assize. Sit with this for a second. At this level, you're not really selling bread anymore. You're selling the guild's seal of trust, proof to a monastery or a noble household that your loaf is exactly the weight and quality the law demands. The bread is the delivery mechanism, the license is the product. For the aspirational figure, take a real one. Thomas Fariner. He joined London's Bakers' Company in 1637, had his own shop on Pudding Lane by 1649, and rose to become the King's Baker, supplying ship's biscuit to the Royal Navy during the war with the Dutch. By 1666, tax assessors recorded his property as having 5 hearths and an oven, a genuinely large, prosperous household for the period, in a trade where most people's whole house had 1 or 2. Then, on the 2nd of September 1666, an ember from that same oven, in that same kind of crowded street of timber buildings bakers had been packed into for centuries, started the Great Fire of London. One baker's furnace, badly raked out for the night, went on to destroy roughly 13,000 houses and reshape the entire city. He rebuilt on the same spot and kept baking until his death in 1670. That's the number that matters here. 1 oven, 1 bad night. 13,000 houses. So you still want to own a medieval bakery. Just remember, you're not really buying an oven. You're buying a license that a king can enforce on your own body, on a street built to burn down together, selling a product priced by a stranger who's never once worked a shift in your bakehouse.